Hey everyone, welcome back to the channel. Pretty obvious what we're talking about today. This is the Elegoo Jupiter, and many of you have probably seen and heard of this machine. It's been teased, tested, and reviewed by many other way more popular YouTubers than I. But this is going to be our take. I don't feel like a lot of them have been coming at it from any particular point of view. For us as a jewelry channel, we're definitely going to be looking at it from that lens, and just generally from a business perspective. So just to start things off, of course, this video has not been sponsored by Elegoo or anyone else for that matter. We purchased this unit with our own funds in the 2021, I think it was September, Kickstarter campaign that Elegoo ran for this machine. I'm honestly not a fan of the fact that they had to do, or decided to do rather, not had to, decided to do a Kickstarter campaign at all, because Elegoo is a very large, very popular company. They probably, almost certainly had the funds, they had the recognition to do this themselves without running a Kickstarter. That's not really what Kickstarter's for, and all that entails. So that's kind of the more political side of this. I'm not really going to get into it, but I want to know, what did they deliver on, and what does it excel at? What does it fail at? So before we get into anything too specific, let's just talk about what's in front of us. And forgive me, I'm going to have to kind of like literally orbit around this machine so I can talk to you about it, because I can't actually get into the front to show you very well from this angle. This is an incredibly large machine, obviously. It weighs about 40 kilos, about 80 pounds approximately, and the entire outer case, the shell of this machine, is all steel and aluminum, which is definitely a big improvement for a lot of Elegoo's products, which tend to be more plasticky with a few little aluminum components sprinkled on top. So it's really nice to see something a lot more rugged and stiff. So looking inside the print chamber, the first thing that we'll talk about is the build plate. The build plate is, of course, by comparison to what my daily driver is, the Prusa SL1S, truly huge. And I believe it's about it's about 3 times as big as a Mars 3. The build plate is truly huge. I was really looking forward to being able to work with this much build volume. I'm really happy that when they decided to design this printer, unlike all of the Mars and the Saturn ones, where you have that ball mechanism, and that's the leveling, that they decided to take the leveling off of the plate itself and put it onto the machine. By doing so, they actually make it so that when you put it back, regardless of how you've had to manhandle the giant print off of this plate, it should always hypothetically be going back to that same level state all the time. Behind the build plate, we have this massive, truly massive Z-axis. I'm really, really pleased to see that they switched to a double ball screw. Specifically, the double ball screw I find to be very important, because double ball screws have much less, I believe it's called backlash or whiplash or something like that. Basically, the time it takes, that little bit of torque for the screw to actually engage. These ones have virtually none of that. So as soon as it starts to spin, it is moving all at once. And then on either side of that huge double ball screw, we have the dual linear rails. I'm not sure how necessary dual linear rails were, as one linear rail should be enough to constrain it this way. But I do think it was a good idea, because I'm not sure how stable linear rails are forward, which this type of printer, that's definitely of key concern. When it comes to FDM printers, they're moving back and forth. You want it to be constrained so that it moves in a nice smooth pattern when you're trying to get, XY axis. With this one, this needs to resist forces. As the plate comes down and it's peeling off of this truly monstrous vat, it needs to be able to resist as it's pulling up and not tip forward. So I do think dual linear rails were a good choice. However, it has yet to be seen if that was the best option. Under that, of course, we have the vat. The resin vat, mine's actually particularly dirty, by the way. I just kind of roughly cleaned this up by the time we got here. I need to replace my FEP as well. The vat is huge, and it's about similar to Mars and Saturn ones in, aesthetically speaking, except they do have these big handles, which are absolutely necessary. The overall construction is solid metal, This thing back here is for the refill. You can screw a special lid onto a resin bottle and plop that in the back. And what it does is it just simply continuously feeds resin into the vat. So if you're doing something truly massive, you're never going to run out of resin, hypothetically. I've actually printed some adapters. You can find those at the link below. I've put them on my printables page for free, so feel free to go pick those up. This is a very simple refill mechanism, and I've had a little bit of trouble with it just simply not working. Either it depresses and resin doesn't flow out, or it doesn't lock in properly, or just for some reason it hasn't worked excessively well. It's a very, as I said, a very simple mechanism, and I feel like it could have been a little bit more sophisticated. Personally, I prefer the way that Anycubic went with their M3, the Mega, the new one that they just put out, with the resin pump and the sensor so that it can actually refill as needed. This one, it just kind of like gravity feeds it. Having a bottle upside down like this it's a bottle full of toxic chemical. You don't want it to leak. And if it does leak by some chance, well, you're gonna have a big mess to clean up. Otherwise, it does work more or less exactly as intended. Under the vat is a 6K LCD monochrome panel, which has absolutely no glass on it. Much like many of the other Elegoo products, this is just a raw panel, so absolutely necessary. Get yourself some screen protectors, because replacing this LCD panel is not cheap, and disasters when it comes to printing are, well, they're always within reach. When you get to a machine of this scale, you're talking big disasters much easier, because you've got such a thin sheet of FEP. Any puncture, any tiny little hole, you're getting a leak. It sticks to the LCD, and I believe it's about $150 USD to replace them, and they're not even available yet. Lastly, inside the print chamber, there's this little box in the back that I'm sure you've seen. There's a carbon filter inside, and this is supposed to filter and clean the fumes out of the air inside the print chamber. I have found this to be absolutely false. It does not work at all. It is easily overpowered. I bet you it could have some effect on something like a Mars printer size, but at this scale, it has made zero difference. The place where this printer normally lives in my house is on an industrial shelf that I've actually set up with ventilation and like an updraft. So basically all the fumes just kind of get sucked up out the back. At this scale of printing, you're going to have to deal with print fumes a lot. And if you're very sensitive to that, I would strongly recommend at least using this back panel. This is something that I can credit Elegoo massively. There's a little back panel screwed on just behind that air filter where you can attach your own, a computer fan, and you could duct this straight up and out exactly the way I've described, but a lot more locally if you don't want to have a whole industrial shelf set up like us. By the way, that shelf setup is a DIY, and we made a video about it, so follow the link below and you can check out how we did that. In the top, you see these floodlights, and I say air quote floodlights because they are very poor. There was actually a thing on the Kickstarter, people wanted them to be a little bit nicer. The original ones that Elegoo installed were very warm, and a lot of people did not like that. I fully agree. I like the bluer lights. I think it's like 5,000 K or something. I quite like them. However, they they suck. Let's put it that way. There's not enough light at all. I would like to see a set of lights in the back and then maybe a set of lights at the front as well. It's better than nothing, but it's definitely substandard. They could have done much better. And you can toggle those lights on or off in the panel on the front. Something I would have liked to see Elegoo do with this door, by the way, is made it so that it could fit on either side. Because if you don't have a space where this left, or I guess it's the right side panel works, you have no option because of these cutouts. I also would have liked to see just that extra little step. There is a magnetic closure here, but if it could have been so that when this closes and a sensor trips, it turns those floodlights off, would have been a really nice little touch. When it opens, turns them on. Again, just would have been nice. But Elegoo didn't do that. I'm sure that it's a fairly simple mod. Maybe you can do it with some kind of Amazon basic product, who knows. It's something that could be looked at for sure, including those two extra lights at the front possibly. So how does this printer print? Which is, of course, one of the most important things about a 3D printer. Does it print well? I can safely say that what I have managed to get printed turns out pretty good. The XY pixel resolution on this machine is 50 microns, which is exactly the same as my daily driver, the Prusa SL1S, which I print jewelry on all the time. So it's just a larger screen with more pixels, and it's great. I know 8K is the big thing right now, trying to cram as many pixels as possible. I feel like at this scale, this is perfectly usable. However, when it comes to printing, I have had no shortage of issues. I would say every single print, not a single one, has actually turned out perfect. If you watched the video that we did last week about printing jewelry items en masse, like how many could you actually fit on this bed, you saw that I had huge amounts of problems with bed adhesion. For whatever reason, the bed on this printer just cannot get flat. It does not level. I have gone through the instructions word for word. I have tried other things. I've tried everything. There's only so many times where I can level the bed, verify that it's level, double check with, get in there with a camera, try all the tricks of the trade, everything I know, everything that the instructions tell me, change resin settings, etc., and you still get bad prints. You just have to start thinking, like, is it user error or is it a design issue? I don't want to jump to the conclusion that it's a design issue immediately. I feel like user error is definitely 90% the problem. I've tried multiple resins. I've also gone so far as to try monocure plate bond, which is an additive that you smear on the surface, you paint it on. And I don't know exactly what it is. It's some kind of extra photo initiator or something, but it makes the resin ultra sticky to the build plate. And it did make a difference for what actually stuck. It was actually so stuck that it was almost, I would almost consider it welded to the surface. It was like plastic and aluminum so bonded together, I had to chip it off with a hammer almost. Hey guys, Future Dan here. This is a bit of an addendum because we recorded the review and stuff like this a week ago, and it just so happened that we were able to leave everything up for the full week. But we had a really good, stimulating conversation with someone, I didn't catch their name, but on Instagram, it's Tiger 3D Printing. They reached out to us and they mentioned a theory about why we're getting such poor bed adhesion. Now, this is happening to us very consistently, where the front is sticking very well, but the back is, it is sticking. You can actually see, like this layer here, it worked. But then you actually get delaminations and things like that. It's really weird. You don't really see stuff like this with 3D printing very much. But they had a theory about why this is happening, and I concur with it almost 100%. The theory is that this massive build plate, when it drops down into the vat of resin, it is creating such a massive amount of displacement force that resin has not had a chance to actually settle. And as such, because it's trying to create such a small gap, there is so much flex happening in this machine that it is warping everything. This actually makes a ton of sense because when we reviewed that Asiga printer, they actually have sensors that specifically measure this force. Clearly, Elegoo does not have that. But they do have a solution called light off delay. This is the most basic of settings that you could possibly utilize when dealing with these displacement forces. Now, I'm not sure where Tiger 3D Printing got his data from, but he mentioned that there's a displacement force between the plate and the LCD panel ultimately. The FEP is just kind of in between. That force is equal to about 20 kilograms. The bigger the plate, the more forces you're dealing with. So about 55 pounds worth of downward force between here and here makes a lot of sense. I feel like Elegoo did a really good job of engineering this Z-axis. I assumed that this Z-axis was actually attached to the case. I'm just actually reaching behind now. There is nothing back here except some wiring. So this steel case, the chassis, is actually contributing absolutely nothing to the rigidity of this really tall Z-axis. But I don't feel like the z-axis is actually the problem when it comes to resisting these displacement forces and any kind of torque that's happening between, everything. I feel that it's actually the top plate. And more specifically than the top plate, the screen. The screen itself is, just a very thin LCD. It doesn't even have a glass protector on it to help with the rigidity. So if there's anything happening where it's going to flex, I feel like it's the screen. The screens, of course, are screwed on loosely, but then they're just kind of sealed on with tape. Elegoo doesn't really take a great approach to attaching these screens to the chassis. I don't know how thick this chassis is. At some point, I may take that off, this front plate off, and just double check. But if we look into these air vents on the side, you can see that there is no support structure whatsoever underneath this panel. It's just kind of flat. And when we're talking about 20 kilos of force, it's going to need as much possible help as it can. So I definitely think Elegoo did a great job up here, but they forgot a lot of stuff down here in the bottom. This is, again, just a theory. The light-off delay suggestion that was made to me was 60 seconds on the base layers when we were talking about the rafts. After that, as soon as you start getting into supports and things, it doesn't have nearly as much displacement because, well, it's not trying to squish two perfectly flat pieces together. So it makes a lot of sense. For your burn-in layers, if you have an Elegoo Jupiter and you're working with a lot of these layer adhesion problems like I am, I suggest you start at 60-second light-off delay for your burn-in layers, and if that's just too long, work it down. I don't know if 60 seconds is absolutely necessary. Maybe it's 30 seconds. It really, really depends on the temperature of your resin, the viscosity, just tons of different factors. But start with 60 seconds, see what happens, because I feel like this is going to solve a lot of our problems. So what are my overall opinions about this machine? I've spent a few weeks with it, and frankly, if you have printed with Elegoo machines before, this is exactly the same experience, except it's bigger. It's just like a jumbo Mars 3 or a Saturn. The UI is extremely simple and frankly unsophisticated as it is locked to the Chidu system. There was a number of projects with the Chidu system in particular, with the Chidu box, where this guy, I couldn't even make it work. I had to switch over to Lychee Slicer. It doesn't matter if you're using Chidu Basic or Pro, that software just does not work very well. For me, at least, if you're having great experiences, awesome, but I would ask you, try loading a large file. For example, this ring one was, I think, 1.5 gigabytes. Tell me how long it takes you to slice, because I left it for hours and it did nothing. It just locks up and it doesn't work. I don't know if this is a thing that is just, my version of the software. I'm up to date. I have Pro, but it doesn't seem to ever make a difference. So my biggest issue, obviously, with this entire machine is the leveling mechanism. I do not think it is very well done at all. The entire thing relies on these 4 side bolts, which lock in these 4 vertical bolts, which have the springs and the acorn nuts, and then lock into the build plate itself. If you were to over-tighten this build plate, I don't think it's unreasonable that you could pull up through those friction fit bolts and knock the entire thing out of whack without ever even knowing it. So in this case, I think the mechanism is very poor. I don't necessarily like the way Elegoo does it with the Saturn and the Mars with that ball thing, because as soon as you take that build plate off and you go to scrape it, you just kind of have to assume that it's no longer level. At this scale, I almost guarantee that same mechanism wouldn't work, so I'm glad that they tried to do something different. Whether or not it was the right kind of different, I genuinely don't believe so. One of the other annoyances that I have is that the screws that hold the vat down are positioned in exactly the wrong place, right underneath the handles. And they are very, very long. It takes a while to get them out, and it's harder still when you're wearing gloves. And if you're not exactly straight on with it, it's really difficult. I kind of have to do this with mine because just the placement of it. So it's really, really inconvenient. I feel like a better hold down mechanism could have been devised. My next big annoyance is light leak. There is so much UV light flooding out of these side grills and the bottom. It is rather worrying, frankly. Normally this wouldn't bother me too much, but if we think bigger picture, just from a safety standpoint, if you have kids or pets and they're down here at table level, and they look up at that for any length of time, that cannot be good for their eyes. I know if you Google 405 nanometer UV light, they say that it's not harmful, but if you go and stare at that light for any length of time, I would challenge that your eyesight is not getting better. Now, if safety isn't your prime concern when it comes to that, you're willing to live with it, that's fine. However, does that mean that there's light actually getting all the way up to the screen? Is it hitting the panel and then reflecting off? Is it just aimed improperly? I don't know. Could it be fixed? I hope. But either way, light leak, no matter what you say about it, I do not really approve. So in summary of the Elegoo Jupiter, I am not a huge fan of Elegoo products in general, and this has not changed my mind. The increased build quality on the case and the Z-axis are very refreshing to see. I love that they're starting to move things forward a little bit. I like that those components are coming down to the point where they're more affordable. As a business owner, I would never in a million years trust this machine to be printing rings. If I have to deal with a third of the loss like every single time, or even if it's just half the time, it doesn't matter. When you're printing in a castable resin, like I do a lot, you cannot afford to have this kind of waste. At $100 a bottle, all the way up to $300 a bottle, this machine is capable of holding about $1,000 worth of material at a time. That is the type of loss that, as a small business owner, really, really hurts. Like, maybe I wouldn't sink, but if that happened over and over again, even when I'm just trying to get it working, like the dialing in process, man, that is a lot of money to be losing all at once. By no means am I actually done working with large format machines. I would love to get my hands on numerous others. I really hope that Prusa is working on one. I've been a fan of the SL1S for a very long time, and that's currently still their only printer. If they could enter into the large format, I guarantee that would be a very, very fancy machine. I really hope that this is just having to do with my personal machine. I really hope that there are people out there who are having amazing success with it, but this is my own experience, and that's all I can really report on. So that's all for this video. Thank you very much for watching. I'm sorry it wasn't the best news, but you know what? I'm not going to make this up. I'm not going to sugarcoat it and try to sell you on this machine. I do not have an affiliate program with Elegoo. They did not send me anything. I even told them I was a YouTube channel going to review this. I didn't get it any sooner. I didn't get it any discount on it. I'm not getting anything for this. This is just my honest opinion, exactly as you see it. It is what it is. You can take it or leave it. I'll see you guys in the next one.